Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. The questions I had, and you'll have to forgive my ignorance, but what is the point of, what are you going to actually get from the genetic data in layman's terms? What is it going to tell you?
Well, that's a good question, and I'd love to pass the microphone over to the PhD student who's down in South Texas right now.
Yes,
because
we're working on getting those guys in here too. We'll get
exactly
more detailed information from them hopefully in the future. But
Evan and Randy and Michael Barrett is the PhD student, so they're still working on that. But yeah, in layman's terms, the part, and selfishly maybe the part I'm most interested in is from a landscape level perspective. You think about things like highways, or increasingly in some parts of Oklahoma where we've got changing land cover, to and from ag, ranch land, in some places energy extraction, right? Or wind, so extractive like oil and natural gas, but also wind farms. Depending on where we're at, and I'm not saying that impacts every place equally, but all of a sudden that landscape starts to look a lot different. And what genetics might be able to show us is whether or not there's actual gene flow from one area to the next. Because we might look at the map and think, well, turkey, that's connected. Turkey could just do this, but they might not perceive it that way. And if you strapped on enough backpacks, you probably could get at that answer eventually, because you'd say, man, we've trapped a bunch of turkeys over here and a bunch of turkeys over here. We've never seen them do this or that across this interstate. Absolutely, we could do that with just movement data. But that could take a lot of backpacks and a lot of study sites and a lot of monitoring and a lot of years. And this, molecular approach, a genetic approach, might jumpstart the idea that we could look for those types of barriers. So I hope that later Evan and Randy don't tell you, no, we're not going to do that at all. but so getting down in the weeds on the actual tests and how the analyses work and the different metrics they can use is probably beyond the interest of most of your listeners. But I think that's the story of how are turkeys using that landscape, and is our landscape, for right or for wrong, actually impeding their ability to be successful. It might explain, for example, areas that get isolated and are now more predisposed, if they get hit with an ill-timed storm, to decline rapidly. And now you're worried, well, is there not going to be an influx of other turkeys that can come back in and for lack of a better word, rescue that otherwise isolated population? So that's where we're coming at.
Like you said, it may be an invisible barrier.
It may absolutely be invisible to us. Absolutely. Because a highway is an easy one to make people think about a barrier, but that's pretty visible. But when you talk about changing land use practices, and I've been out there a couple times now and looked at some of these areas along river corridors where we've got, woody encroachment in riparian areas that may make entire otherwise suitable roost trees completely unusable to a turkey.
I'm glad you touched on that.
So that on a map, you go, well, here's a riparian corridor with a bunch of trees in it. I don't know why turkeys wouldn't do good here. And then you go out there and you go, oh, they don't want to fly up in these trees because they can't fly back down unless they wait till noon. And even then they're going to be on pins and needles because they're trying to figure out a hole in the cedars to jump through,
Yeah.
So that's a big deal that we can start to see that, but this genetic level, more landscape level approach might allow us to start pointing, even if it doesn't answer the question, it might start pointing to finer scale questions that we can follow up on. And I think that's a really cool strength. Well, I hope, it ends up being a strength of this project. I think it's a really cool approach. So.
Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
glad you brought up that issue on woody encroachment underneath these roosts, because last summer I didn't really appreciate the value of roost sites, of having quality roost sites to Rios, until last summer. Stephen Webb and I, he's at Texas A&M College Station, went down to a large ranch in South Texas, and we were talking to landowner there, the land manager, and discussing some potential research opportunities, because they've been seeing this issue on that particular ranch where, where they previously may have had 20 something roost sites that were occupied every winter, that was steadily going down, and I think they were down to something like 12 or 13, and they weren't exactly sure why they were losing some of these roost sites, whether it was just that there were no longer enough turkeys to occupy all the sites, or if there was some habitat change that had occurred over time that no longer made them suitable as roost sites. But yeah, we don't think about that from an eastern perspective as much, because we're surrounded by roost all the time,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's
Mhm.
trees everywhere.
A lot of time we're
Um,
trying to get rid of some of the
that's
roosts.
right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Narrow
But
down where they can go. Yeah.
it's a much
Mm.
more valuable commodity down there, and I wondered if that was part of the conversation
Mm-hmm.
as far as what's going on with the Rios in western Oklahoma.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we'll have, obviously that we started talking about that because of the genetic piece, but the actual trapping piece I alluded to a minute ago, we're going to do 4 winters and subsequent spring nesting seasons on the eastern part, and we're in year 2 of that right now. We're doing 3 on the Rio part. We're in year 1 of
Hmm.
that right now. So we will have uh, GPS backpacks on hens uh, in western Oklahoma that will be able to follow up for things like nest site selection, nest success, poult survival, hopefully pull off a brood, mark some poults, do some poult survival stuff. So we will be getting at that issue, will, at finer scale, with how they're using the landscape via the backpacks. But like I said, I think it's kind of like 2 different levels. It's a really zoomed out landscape level from a genetics perspective, and then a more of a zoomed in individual level when you're talking about strapping a backpack to an individual hen
Hmm.
and seeing where she roosts. And I actually previewed some of the data off of one of the hens recently. The student out there, the western side of our project is being run by Craig Davis and Sam Fuhlendorf, and they're supervising Cody Griffin, who's a PhD student, and I'm on his committee. And he sent me a little shiny app that he made to quickly view some of the GPS points. And I just picked one of the hens at random, and I'm looking at the landscape map behind it, going, where are you going to go? Because I'm trying to figure out where there's trees. And man, for like 4 days in a row, she roosted. I swear. I mean, there was technically a little group of trees, but where the dot would stop when she would go to roost, I swear if I zoomed in, I was like, I bet that's in the same tree every night. And she's coming back to
Hmm.
this same tree. Maybe there's 2 trees and she's in one or the other. But even within that little patch, she was always in this one spot. And that's anecdotal, right? That's one
Yeah.
individual. But it's made me think a lot about that, because I'm like, y'all, I come from Georgia originally. I'm a Southeastern guy. There's trees everywhere. Like, we're usually not worried about roost sites being limiting. Maybe there's pros and cons of different areas, of course. But yeah, when I started hunting Rios in western Oklahoma, and I really started doing that in earnest last spring, I remember one night one evening being on a property, and there was a gobbler with, I think, 3 or 4 hens, and they were off the property. I was on like, it's private land, but it's enrolled in public access. It's a program, state agency
Hmm.
program. So I'm on the, let's call it, public part, but I'm looking at a neighbor's ranch that is not publicly accessible, and they're close enough that, like, tiny part of me would think, like the Marcus story from earlier, I might could call them over here. And then I'm looking at my watch and thinking about, and I'm looking over here the way they're going. And as far as I could see that way, there was one little group of trees, and then I pulled up Onyx and I was like, oh, that's where they're going. They got nowhere else to go. Like, they're beating
Hmm.
tracks because, man, it's
Mhm.
time to get over there and get ready to roost. Otherwise, we're just out here on top of these windswept, grass covered hills. So
Mhm.
it's a really cool system to hunt in. It's very different, for somebody like us, originally from the Southeast. Um, but it did make me think a lot more about roosting cover and how landscape change could be altering that component of turkey life history. which I don't think, admittedly, I don't think about a lot when I think about Easterns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But even with Easterns, like, I worked with a landowner in Alabama last summer that was concerned that they had lost a major roost site on their property because they clear cut a stand that was surrounding one of their traditional, you know, frequently used roost sites, and they allowed that to naturally regenerate into hardwoods. And they saw that, use of that site as a roost just went away. And
Yep.
so maybe those birds are finding somewhere else, that's just as suitable to roost. And so you're not affecting the overall population at, say, like a countywide level, but losing that quality roost on a particular property can certainly affect your hunting experience there.
Absolutely. And I actually love that point, Will, because when I first started turkey hunting, one of the places, we had a small lease that backed up on national forest in northwest Georgia. And there was one spot at the top of a ravine where, it was a very consistent roost for, male and female turkeys. I'm, talking about in the spring, whether they're roosted together or not. And it was quite remarkable that if you just walk up there and you look around, think, well, right there, 150 yards away, is a ridge of the exact same size with basically the exact same tree cover. But why is it always right here? You could draw a circle in a 50, 60 yard diameter circle, and by and large, every turkey would be in one of those trees, whether it was a single gobbler roosted alone there one morning or 6 hens and a tom the next morning, whatever. And I just remember, even I was probably in like middle school age, maybe, when I first actually started going turkey hunting. And it did not take me very long on that property to know where I would expect turkeys to be roosted. And also already wonder, why there when that tree right there looks exactly the same, So I get it. I was saying, admittedly, I don't think about it as much, only because we assume that there's good availability, but certainly on the Rio side, when it's much more limited, then it's easier to go, ooh, wow, that could really affect a hen's ability to succeed in the spring, and not necessarily be associated with where she puts her nest, but maybe be associated with whether or not she's got access to safe roost sites for her. So,
Well, I was just thinking about that. It's particularly during the laying period that hen might be anchored to a roost site, and she's having to choose where to nest based on where there is a roost.
Well, that's a fair point. Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting. Another point that I've been mulling over through this, and we've talked about this in different ways, but you were talking about ill-timed weather. Well, you could point fingers and say, "Oh, the weather is changing, and that's ill-timed," or maybe other things are changing, like habitat quality that they would use for nesting and brooding, and because that has changed, they're now more vulnerable to that weather. Right? Just it's the same. We had the argument with turkeys a lot, where people were like, "Well, all the predators are eating the turkeys. Why are you saying that? It may not be predation." It's like, well, predation risk isn't necessarily related to an increase in abundance of predators. It could also be, and may well be, given some data that we presented from multiple studies, that turkeys have less places or less adequate cover to hide from predation. So predation is a symptom of the problem in that case. And I wonder about that weather issue as well. After you're talking about all this landscape change, is it actually a symptom,
or is it a problem? Yep. No, agreed. It's like I always say, it's like looking at a Venn diagram. Everybody kind of knows how to draw one of those. So you put a bunch of these things in bubbles, and then you realize, well, man, a lot of those can overlap. And now all of a sudden you're wondering, well, am I dealing with an interaction here, or is it just one or just the other? And I think you're absolutely right. And that's why, we're early yet in our Oklahoma project. So we're kind of keeping everything on the table. We're not trying to assume that it's all predator driven, or it's all weather driven, or it's all woody encroachment driven, but rather look at those things kind of in an interactive way, to try to figure out essentially the kind of the old lowest hole in the bucket analogy, right? There might be quite a few holes, but if you fill the top one because it's easy, the water's still leaking out of the bottom, And so where each of those topics falls in the proverbial bucket, I don't know. But I think a lot of folks are trying to get at that, and I think,
Yeah.
as y'all have alluded to on your podcast many times, it might even be different in different areas. But we don't know unless we investigate it and hopefully ask better questions and get better data, and then act on the data that tell us to act.
Right.
So so I mentioned, I guess the only other thing I want to make sure to get in there particularly for folks listening, because they maybe are from Oklahoma or they have hunted or interested in hunting in Oklahoma, is the data we do have so far. You mentioned predation, Marcus, and I completely agree. I'm not a kill all the predator person, but as you know, you and I've done a lot of work even with whitetail deer, and then I've subsequently worked on elk as well and pronghorn. And the first year in the southeast, we were monitoring hens, and we did lose. I think we lost 3 hens prior to nesting season, from the time they were trapped to the time we were expecting to be looking for incubation behavior.
Out of how many were trapped?
It was 28. I believe it was 28 hens, and I think we lost 3 before nesting or incubation began. And over the course, now zooming out real quick, over the course of the whole spring and summer, we had 13 monitored hens die, and 10 of those were documented as predation, or at least provided evidence to indicate the most likely cause of death was predation. Now, again, y'all know, from a science perspective, we're always trying to be really critical of that. Like, okay, yeah, I've got a body here and I can tell a predator's had a hold of it. Well, how do I know if it was scavenging or not? Do I know if she, maybe the hen had some sort of toxin problem, right, that predisposed her to predation? Well, we're only as good as the level of monitoring that we can accomplish. So I put a big asterisk by that, but it was of note, at least in the southeast, because I think both some agency folks and other partners that we have, back to your first question about the different hypotheses, I think folks expected there to be a larger predator related component to hen and nest and poult mortality in the southeastern part of the study, perhaps, than they did in the Rio part. And one of the reasons I think that kept coming up is actually what you just hinted at, is the fact that predator piece is interacting with a rapidly changing landscape in eastern Oklahoma as well. But that landscape might be changing for different reasons. So we're actually working in southeast Oklahoma on a combination of properties. We've got at least one big WMA that's run, managed by ODWC, U.S. Forest Service land, so federal land that we have access to. Weyerhaeuser, we've got a memo of understanding, or an agreement, a use agreement with Weyerhaeuser to be able to trap on certain parts of their property, and or, if not trap, follow up on tagged birds that might go on there to nest or to die if we had a mortality or whatever. And then there's other private landowners that are, like you alluded to before with hunters. There's quite a few landowners that are just really interested in the project. And my grad student got a call, it's been a month ago now, from a random person that she'd never heard of, and they had talked to a game warden. Game warden gave her number, and they called up and said, "Hey, I got 20 turkeys using my back pasture every day. I'm about such and such. Would that be something you'd be interested in trapping?" And she's like, "Yeah, actually that would work really well." So they go out there and meet. They talk about, where to set up the rocket netting is how we're catching the Easterns. So how are we going to set that up? And unfortunately, after all that, Will, talking about you bad luck with rain, southeastern Oklahoma has gotten pounded late this winter with rain. And my student Nicole, I feel so bad for her because she worked so hard, and she's got all these birds located, and then we can't trap. That actual field, she sent me a picture, which I'm not even going to try to show you. Won't do it justice right now, but it looks like a lake. That pasture was like 2 feet deep in water. So we went from like this cool new connection to a landowner who had neighbors who were going to allow us to follow up if the hens got on their property. And now, at least for this winter, couldn't do it. Basically, I mean, because by the time the waters receded, she was going to have to reset the site. The birds, of course, that weather system came through and it just kind of shocked them into weirdness. So that all of a sudden they weren't on any sort of pattern anymore. So that's pretty brutal. That much like a hunter, who only has a few days to go, is hoping that it's not just straight thunderstorms all day long. Well, we run in the same thing with trying to trap because we don't want to kill turkeys by trapping at inopportune times, or I shouldn't say kill them, but like predispose them to trapping associated mortality because they're too wet, or it gets too cold after they've been wet. Obviously their feathers can be damaged in the netting process. So anyway, so we're in our second year now trapping down there, and back to my point, I guess we had what appeared to be a reasonable, a fairly notable predation component that was not only getting some of the adult hens, but ultimately the fates of the nests that we had were fairly well split. We actually had 2 hens. Let me start over. We had 9 incubated nests by 7 hens. We lost access to some hens because we are in a matrix of access, and unfortunately there were some hens that we weren't able to follow up on from a nesting perspective. But of the 9 nests that we know were incubated, that was done by 7 hens. So that means 2 of those hens did a renest. And 2 hens were killed on their nest during incubation. And 2 other hens lost their nest to predation or scavenging, though they themselves were not killed in that process. So again, we don't know if they were off on a recess and something found it, or maybe they did get flushed off by a predator, and then the predator took what they wanted and scavengers took the rest. And then we had 1 abandoned for an unknown reason, non-research related, but it was just abandoned. And then 2 hatched, and both of the nests that hatched were renests. So we had 1 hen hatch, I believe, 5 poults in a nest of 5 eggs, and 1 hen hatched 3 poults in a nest that contained 4 eggs. So she actually had 1 egg that was unhatched. And the result, fast forward, spoiler, none of the poults made it, marked or otherwise. One group, the first group, made it to almost 3 weeks of age, and they and the mom were killed in a predation event. And then the other poults, the mother was fine, but the poults died within the first, I think it was 3 days, give or take, pretty early. That's one of those poults was recovered out of the belly of a cottonmouth. That was pretty. Yeah. I think I told you about that, Marcus, because y'all had talked about that before. So,
See, and I reminded Will because we talked on the air, and I could not remember if it was the quail example or a poult, and then you reminded me some time ago after we had already released that recording that I was remembering correctly that someone had told me that a poult ended up in one.
Yeah, that was just one, and it was a young one. It was, like I said, it was 2 or 3 days old. But the technician tracked it to oddly enough, it tracked it to a dead snake. So the snake, he was like tracking along and goes, "Oh, there's a dead snake," and then looks down and sees a lump in it, and then he took a video of like the transmitter. And so because the snake was already dead, they did open it up and confirm that the poult was inside with the transmitter attached.
What killed the snake?
No idea. That actually is probably a far more interesting question than the fact that a snake would eat a poult. We know that.
Probably some lithium from the transmitter battery or something.
They tried to look to see if the transmitter could have harmed it internally, but there was no evidence that happened. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, because we're not all obviously veterinarians or anything. But somebody speculated they weren't sure if there was. I think there was some pig rooting in the area. So there was some speculation, well, maybe pigs had been through there and they came across the snake and they killed it, but they didn't eat it. I don't know how.
Wait, was that the mama that mama was still alive? Presumably,
she was. Yeah,
I've gotten a couple of really cool videos of a hen really getting after a snake.
Really?
Yeah. So I wonder, even mama could have done that.
Maybe that's a good point. I didn't think about
to
that.
be a fly on the wall for that whole process.
Oh my
Yes.
gosh!
Well, exactly.
Doesn't it
I mean,
feel a little bit like Inception or something, where it's just like,
well, we've got
it's
crazy,
getting too complex.
we've got crazy good data, but even then, you keep getting down to finer and
Yeah.
finer scale where you wish
Well, and
you could
even,
just
you
watch
know,
it real time. You know,
we've got a fair number of folks in the audience, and we've gotten a pretty good feel for how people react to different things. We got a bunch of people about to be screaming about predators.
Yeah, well, and that's why I wanted to give you, you know, just this is back of the napkin, preliminary, 1 year, fairly small sample size so far.
Well, they, you know, they get so mad about it. Wait, you just said a few minutes ago, you're not about, you know, you're not that guy that wants to go kill all the predators off. And then people were like, well, all of them are getting eaten by predators. Look how many of the hens. And then, you know, your other episode, you showed that in your analysis that one of the things that's most important, maybe not as responsive to management, but definitely most important to turkey populations is hen survival. And they're getting killed by predators. But the problem with that, and the reason that there's so much reservation, at least from me, is we don't know if that predation rate is a symptom or causative mechanism.
Absolutely.
Right. Is there actually more predators, or is it actually they're more at risk because of some other thing? And, you know, then if you remove the predators, you don't actually, that's a Band-Aid on the problem instead of solving the problem. And then you don't actually fix anything through an enormous amount of effort of trying to.
Absolutely.
So that's why we're being really careful about this, because for the predation to dramatically change, I just have a hard time believing it's because there's 10 times as many coyotes out there or whatever.
Yeah.
You know,
and I think, yeah, I completely agree, Marcus. And Dwayne and I talk about this a lot because Dwayne and I have focused mostly on the eastern part of the study so far. And again, all the preliminary data I just shared is from last year, year one there, and that's why we give it with that big caveat, because we talk a lot the same way me and you. I mean, we had a phone call recently. We were on the phone for like an hour and a half because we start brainstorming, you know, different ideas.
That's going to be next week's episode. I clicked record.
You just recorded our phone call. Yeah. I hope I didn't say anything stupid, but anyway,
you did. I'm sure of it, but we'll cut that
out. Okay. But we agree, Marcus, and we don't want to. That's why I'm giving a big caveat to those results, because there's also some noise associated with how those cause of death determinations are made. Now, we are following like very established protocols, but it doesn't mean that every day you're perfect. I mean, again, we talked about a hailstone. You knock a hen in the head and then she gets chewed on by a coyote. If you get there and there's no head, and all you know, then you might go, oh man, it looks like a coyote killed this. Like, well, that in that case you'd be wrong.
If you take a hen and put her in a cage with the bobcat's going to eat the hen. Right? But the cause of death is not the bobcat in that case.
Just because you put her in the cage.
I put her in a cage with it. Like you know, if we take habitat and whittle it down to a level where they can't escape predation, then you end up with a really high predation rate. So there's multiple explanations for this, and that's why we're being a little bit careful about it, because there's imperfect data, and we also don't know whether it's a symptom or cause in terms of the mechanism. And I think we have a lot of our listeners with us, but there's a vocal few that are on both sides of this argument that you know, get upset with us for exposing the fact that there's uncertainty here, even though you have some remarkable data and tools to get that data. It's still really hard to determine what the actual problem is.
The other piece that you have to keep in mind too is, you know, if you go back and listen, if you haven't already, to the Predator series that we just wrapped up recently, we talked about how limited the availability of data is on the effectiveness of predator control to benefit nest success and poult survival. We have, to my knowledge, we have no data showing that predator control can increase adult hen survival. I don't know that a study has ever tried to even document that. So that adds additional uncertainty into this mix.
Agreed.
Right. And what we're kind of talking about, or at least I was, are compensatory mechanisms potentially as well. And I know that we talked about that in the predator issue, but even your anecdote, Colter, you had a hen with a brood and she got eaten, and the brood failed because they all got eaten. But then you had another hen that didn't get eaten, and her brood still failed.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
there was just a different reason to die, and even though it wasn't predation, they still died.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
removing the predator in that case and making her survive doesn't necessarily mean the brood survives. So
Yeah.
if there's some other, if the predation is a symptom of another problem, fixing predation by removing predators may not actually end up increasing it. So all of this is hypotheticals, and we're trying to get at these kinds of questions. But it's really frustrating on our end. And I'll remind everybody, we're a bunch of turkey hunters that want there to be more turkeys. Right, just like everybody else, and we're trying to do our part, and it's just really difficult. And I do feel like I'm in Inception sometimes, or it's
well, you
some
said
kind of weird
but
thing going on.
Can
go ahead,
I build for a second on something Marcus said? I didn't think we were going there in this episode because we've talked about doing a more specific episode, if not a series, on the interaction between habitat and predation.
Yeah.
But to build off of Marcus's example real briefly without going into too much depth, you take that hen and bobcat in a cage. Yeah, she's going to die, and she's going to die quick. But then, you think about expanding the available habitat she has to escape that bobcat, and maybe you put her into like a gymnasium or something like that. She's going to last a little bit longer. She's still going to get eaten. But then you just, you keep scaling that up further and further. And then you start adding complexity and structure to whatever environment that you place them into, and it starts tipping the odds more and more in that hen's favor. And that's the concept that I used to think about the role of habitat and predation. Make them, give the prey animal more room to hide and better places to hide within that room that is available to them to escape the predator.
Yep.
Well, I'll just use one more step in that, if we're going to connect it back to that compensatory kind of idea. If you put that hen in a cage that fenced out the predator, i.e. we got rid of the predator, she's still going to die. Because she's in a cage, right? So if we whittle things down to a level where they don't have any options to sustain some part of their life cycle, we can get rid of predators from the equation totally. And it doesn't matter because they're still in a situation where they can't survive.
Yeah.
So
that's a good point. Well, I wanted to mention one more thing that I know Marcus alluded to earlier with the hunters really kind of stepping up and helping lead the charge on a lot of the funding that's going around, a lot of the interest in various states in the turkey work, and I mentioned that we got some genetic samples from other partners in Oklahoma. But while we're talking about Oklahoma, even beyond here at Oklahoma State, we've actually been working with the Muskogee Creek Nation, who got their own federal funding to trap and transmitter turkeys on Muskogee lands. And so, just again, as kind of a shout out to all the things going on in Oklahoma right now, not just stuff that we're doing. They came down last winter and learned the trapping techniques from me and Dwayne and Nicole. Got all the training they needed, got all the supplies that they needed, ended up securing the funding and getting some backpacks. We helped them get linked up with the, kind of all the different options they had. And so now this year, right now, this 2023 winter, they've done their first trapping effort on Muskogee lands. So they've got
that's awesome.
They're also focused on hens. They're not going to go as intensely into the nest monitoring. They don't have quite the staff and the full amount of resources that we're throwing at our project, but they've got GPS data. They want to see how they're using Muskogee lands. They obviously they've got a natural resources group set up there that's running the trapping, and they want to see how turkeys are using Muskogee lands. And that has snowballed now into additional conversations with Cherokee Nation and the Choctaw Nation, both of whom are incredibly interested and interested in collaborating in any way that they can, but have also expressed interest in potentially seeking their own funding and potentially doing their own trapping if that was in the cards. And again, it depends on their different financial situations and whether or not they have the capacity to undertake a project like that. But I did want to throw that out there because even though me and Dwayne were mostly talking about the work at OSU and our partners at CKWRI, it really has snowballed in Oklahoma to be of broad interest to multiple First Nations groups and obviously the state agency and lots and lots of hunters, many of whom I hope listen to your podcast. At least 3 of them do. You said so.
Yeah. Well, we're trying to change that. We're, our audience is also a really strong advocate for us, and they've been sharing it everywhere. I see it all the time, and rating the podcast and everything. They've been doing us a solid, trying to help us get the word out to more people. So maybe we'll pick up a few more listeners in Oklahoma.
Yeah. Well, we'll spread it around. And
I would say, to those folks that are, wanting more information from the areas that they hunt and manage, it's coming. And that's, this is partially in response to that.
Yep,
absolutely.
Episode.
And I've been doing what I can to spread it around even before famously I got on Instagram, which is now public information that I've joined 2023 officially. But I have spread that around and I've had unsolicited comments through even to my grad students. That they'll run into somebody and they'll be talking about the turkey project and they'll ask Nicole down in Southeast Oklahoma, hey, do you know Marcus Lashley and Will Gulsby? And she's like, well, I don't, but my advisor does. And so we're excited to help get that word out because obviously y'all have got a great platform for getting that information to the folks that want it. And that's folks that are hunting turkeys or managing land or just care about wildlife issues in general. So we're happy to do whatever we can to spread it around and happy to do these updates. Like I said, I know today was probably not quite as cool as like Mormon. I know his update was what?
Well, he had 4 years of
data already collected. Well, we'll be there, but we got to wait a little while.
But we're going to get to see this sausage made.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
To use one of Will's things he said a couple times.
I don't know if I liked it as much the way you said it, Marcus.
Well, I don't care.
In the context.
We'll let the audience vote on that, Will.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm gonna stay out of it.
Yeah. No, you're a mediator now.
You know what's funny though is Colter, you talk about people being familiar with the podcast. I feel I've gotten the opportunity over the past few weeks to meet several people that are listeners, and when I talk to them, it seems like the first thing that they always want to bring up is the coyote turd story.
It took all I could do earlier when you said something about nuggets, golden nuggets. I think Marcus said, and you said some of them are turds. It took all I could do in minute 1 today not to immediately bring up that story, Will, and I just decided not.
So maybe a purple nugget, purple nugget.
So, that story is my contribution to turkey science. So.
Yeah,
I love it.
That was a popular episode, Will. So, it was at your expense, I guess. But,
I was just trying to bring the talent.
Yep. Yeah. Somebody's got to do it, right, Will?
That's what Will said on. I think we actually subsequently had to trash the episode you said it on because we didn't turn the microphone on or something. But it was one of our first recordings. He's like, "You told me all I had to do was bring the talent."
The funny thing is, I meant it as a self-deprecating joke, but then Marcus is like propelled it forward as though I was serious about it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what you get.
No, I'm just picking about it. I wasn't.
Well, whichever roles you're in, I think it's good. It seems like it's working and getting the word out. So we're happy to be
able to hear that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and we wouldn't have a whole lot to share, and the conversations would be short if we didn't have people like you willing to come on and share with us. So I appreciate you as well.
Yeah, I agree. I view that as one of the real strengths. Is we have direct access to all the great scientists like yourself, and we can try to give people more real-time updates so they can see how the sausage is made.
There it is in context. You knew he was going back there. I knew when he started the sentence where it was going in.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, all right. Well,
hopefully that's what you wanted about Oklahoma.
Yeah. Well, we really appreciate it, and thanks everybody out there for listening. And if you've been helping us by rating the podcast and sharing and all that, we really appreciate it. We could not do this without you guys either. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.